We've picked up hints that the government is preparing to cut the welfare bill to deal with the public finances. And also, Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister, remember him? Well, he's back and he's given a really long interview to a BBC podcast. We'll discuss all of that on the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we'll cross over to Westminster to speak to Nick Robinson to hear about Rishi Sunak's return to the political fray, because he's done that 2-hour-long interview, which is available to listen to on Political Thinking, Nick's podcast on BBC Sounds. But first of all, we're going to talk about the current government. And Rachel Reeves, we are told, is penciling in some cuts to the welfare budget, particularly sickness-related benefits, to deal with the fact that the government is facing a grimmer economic picture than they were expecting when Rachel Reeves did her budget in October last year. And the person who's been picking up all these hints and gleaning all there is to be gleaned in Whitehall is the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam, who is here. Hello, Faisal.
Hi, I want squatters' rights.
Yeah, exactly. Please feel free. Stay as long as you like. Right, okay. Before we dive into the details of kind of what you've gleaned, we probably have to set out a bit of, I hate the word context, but just what's the kind of the process that we're in ahead of the Chancellor's big statement on the 26th of March that means there is this news?
There's a sort of what they call a process, it's a tit-for-tat process, where the OBR comes up with an assessment of the economy.
The Office of Budget Responsibility.
Office of Budget, yes, of course, the government's official forecaster. And it tries to mark, if you like, the Treasury's homework. So the Treasury sets itself these rules, these limits on borrowing, self-imposed, and the OBR comes in and does the maths to take away the temptation that you had under previous sort of chancellors to sort of slightly put in optimistic assumptions to fudge tough decisions. So that's the point of it. They go through that process. They loads of inputs. So what's going on in the world? What's going on in Europe? What's going on in global interest markets, exchange rates? Everything goes into a giant blender computer, and out comes some forecasts for the economy and whether or not the government is going to hit that target. Now, at the budget, Rachel Reeves left herself a fairly slim room for manoeuvre of about just under £10 billion at the end of in the single year at the end of the forecast, so 2029-ish.
And that's known as the headroom, isn't it?
That is known as the fiscal headroom, right? And this has become a sort of target whenever there's changes in the economic circumstances that you don't want to miss. Now, our assumption, and I've had nothing to dissuade me from this generalised assumption, is that almost all of that has been used up. And so the challenge at the spring statement, which is
used up as a combination of the economy being less good than people might hope, and the government probably spending a little bit more than they intended to.
Well, it's over 5 years, so it tends to be less about the news in year, but that doesn't help. That's true. It tends to be more about longer run factors. And in particular, the assumptions about things like interest rates. So the fact that government interest rates have gone up from what they assumed in August is a big factor. But then anything that takes away from growth, remember there's a government that argues that it's going to do a whole lot of things that add to growth. Well, the OBR is a little bit sceptical about that these days.
But just to go back to the process then, that is the reason we're talking about this at all today. So what the latest version of the government's kind of future spending plans is going to the OBR.
Well, no,
today.
the Treasury have that, and now they're going to respond, pretty much when people are listening to this, they'll respond with their major measures. That's what the official title, which is, if you like, the course correction to get things back on track in terms of that headroom that we talked about, the government's own homework, meeting its rules. So that's what's going on now. Now, that's not the final stage. The things that they put on this email that's gone to the OBR aren't cast in stone. They can evolve that. The process here is the OBR will say, well, do you know what? We don't think it's going to raise as much money. Actually, it's going to raise a lot more money than we think. That sort of thing is happening. And so I guess the takeaway here is the government knows the size of its challenge, and the government has, as we speak, put forward a set of policies to change that. So we know that now about them, and then we can see and we can divine everything that they say in a different light, knowing that, as I understand, they are focusing, and we've known some of this already at this stage, on multi-billion cuts to the welfare bill and to government spending through efficiency and productivity, and there may be other stuff too, but that's what I know about.
And have you managed to glean anything else about what they think about the welfare bill or how they're going to tackle it? Or do we just know that that's actually the area that they're kind of putting the magnifying glass over?
Well, it isn't just the welfare bill. They're pretty focused on the health outcomes. We talked about it a lot on Newscast, for people at work. There's been a massive increase in that since the pandemic. It's continued, and now it's got even worse. So the question that arises is, are we sicker as a nation? Do we define sickness in a way that's more expansive now? That is very real for the people that are engaged in that. Is that sustainable? Is the generosity of the welfare system too much for this level of sickness? All these questions come to mind. Now, the government is saying privately, this is not the reason why we're doing these sorts of changes. We'd have done them anyway. We want to make welfare work. We've got to fix the welfare bill. But the brutal reality is that at first pass, that will mean either fewer people eligible for some of these benefits, and or, I think probably both, some of them become less generous in order to get this money. We're going to have a speech from Liz Kendall, I think next week, not entirely sure.
The Work and Pension Secretary.
And that may well outline some of those decisions that are taken. Then there's two other speeches, one from the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and from Pat McFadden, the Cabinet Office Minister and General sort of power, about government efficiency. Now, this is where I do some interpretation. I cannot imagine you can get scoreable benefits of many billions of pounds unless you do something very concrete, like shrink the number of civil servants. There may be some other stuff going on here. There may be some, like, do better on contracts. A little twist here, and it's a problem, I think, for the government, is that the OBR had started to say, under pressure from Jeremy Hunt, it was not under pressure, that certain policies would generate growth, and that helps everything. It helps the numbers. It means that hole in the public finances against your self-imposed targets shrinks. So it's exactly what you want. You want to persuade the OBR, I'm going to generate growth. Jeremy Hunt did that a little bit with some of his policies a year or so ago. This time, they happen to have got an independent report in from the Dutch version of the OBR, who have said, do you know what? If you just do that on the way up, you've got to do it on the way down. Otherwise, it's biased. So I think it has emboldened some scepticism on things like Labour's planning reform. So planning reform should yield growth. Can the OBR believe that? And to the extent they don't believe that, there's no benefit.
Yeah, interesting, because my mind is blown about the fact that we're now getting advice from the Dutch version of the Office of Budget Responsibility. I wonder what that is in Flemish.
Well, they're marking their homework, who are marking the Treasury's homework.
Yeah.
So, there we go.
Another way of looking at this is what's the alternative? And like, politicians are really, really like saying there's no alternative. This is why I'm pursuing this course of action. But isn't the alternative here that actually Rachel Reeves changes her fiscal rules, or finds a way of being more generous to herself so she can borrow a bit more? And I'm just thinking about, like, we keep hearing from Brussels that they're going to change the EU's version of the fiscal rules to exclude defence spending so that they can ramp up their defence spending without falling foul of the fiscal rules that they have for themselves. I mean, those are alternatives.
They are. So the first thing to say is that this game about this year's forecast is a bit silly, right? It's like, does it really make a difference? Has the world... we're going to hear a lot actually from the Treasury about how the world has changed. Is this how it's changed? Like a few billion here and there, 0.25% extra in the government interest costs. This is not fundamental. The idea that you greatly change policy as a result of this. And they're stressing headroom or no headroom. This is not why we're making these changes. We'd want to sort out welfare. We'd want to sort out the efficiency of the civil service. But the more fundamental change that you allude to, which is, for example, a 1 percentage point of GDP increase in defence spending, which is entirely plausible. That's where we get into land. How you deal with that, that does raise some really serious questions. And one chart the OBR provided in a very obscure document 2 years ago was to show that the health and welfare bill as a percentage of our national economy went up significantly, but only as we enjoyed the peace dividend, only when defence spending went down from 10% to like even below 2%. And now we're talking about getting it back up to 3%, 5%. Where does that come from? Does that come from shrinking the state, the generosity? It comes initially from shrinking the international aid budget. That's not wholly out of the woods in terms of the Labour Party right now. Where else does it come from? And you make the point about the fiscal rules. Now, at this very moment, practically to the hour, it's not just the European Union, but as you know, the Germans, who have not just a set of fiscal rules, it's hardwired into their constitution.
The famous debt break.
The debt break, exactly. And it's designed to sort of create the utmost credibility. And it eventually led to the fall of the Olaf Scholz government and the election that we've just seen. And they have changed it as a result of the fact that the circumstances have changed palpably. So they're going to exempt defence spending above 1%. They're also on top of that, separately, because the German economy has been pretty moribund, are going to inject 500 billion euros into infrastructure spending. So they have altered to reflect the current circumstances. I think the government, Treasury, Rachel Reeves will argue, well, we have done something similar on infrastructure. We've exempted capital spending. But if people do argue, and it's a fairly common argument, you've heard it on Newscast, that we need to spend tens of billions more on defence now, I think, the argument will come about the fiscal rules. They were forged in a different time.
Well, right? Yeah, and then the other alternative is tax rises. But of course, Rachel Reeves is hemmed in by two pledges: one from the election to not increase the main rates of income tax, employee national insurance or VAT, and then that sort of second pledge she made at the CBI a few months ago, saying actually she wouldn't do a repeat of the last budget, and actually kind of like the big tax rises for this parliament are already done. So she's kind of that's why she can't do tax rises.
And we don't think anything's going to change at the spring statement in 3 weeks' time, but like an obvious route. If you needed a tax-raising weapon, and remember, taxes are still very high now as a proportion, and records have been pushed higher. But if you needed to raise still further, it would be to continue the freeze in income tax thresholds that Conservatives do. Easy in a sense that the Conservatives will find it very difficult to attack that, having done it repeatedly over more than a decade or so. But she sort of dismissed that as an idea in the final flourish of her budget speech in autumn. So she's a little bit restricted on that too, but that's an option maybe for the autumn.
I suppose, though, one of the things that makes it politically easier to do things with the welfare budget is the opposition are probably going to support it. Because I was listening to Nick Robinson's big long interview he's done with Rishi Sunak. So Rishi Sunak's come back to the political stage is a 2-hour-long multi-episode series of political thinking, Nick's podcast. And actually, Rishi Sunak is kind of on board with this stuff. He says, what is his actual phrase? Like the spending on welfare, sickness-related welfare benefits is out of control and unsustainable. Yeah. So actually, the opposition is probably going to go along with anything.
They will go along with it. But the Labour backbenchers have been fairly mute on all sorts of things, including the cut to the aid budget. But although they're not connected at the moment, presentationally at the spring statement, we will also get this, the world has changed, defence spending. I think the Chancellor will start allocating some of that uplift in defence spending and mapping out this route to 3%. Now, at the same time, announcing welfare cuts, well, that might crystallise some, at least, political thought amongst the Labour backbenchers about, okay, we understand that Europe has to rearm, but do we want this to be paid for by international aid? Do we want this to be paid for by a lower welfare bill? And you start now to test the actual limits of what price are the public willing to pay in terms of solidarity with Ukraine, maybe quite a lot. In terms of generalised rearmament, someone's got to pay the bill.
And by the power of podcasting, we're now joined by Nick Robinson, who's in Westminster. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Adam.
Hello. We were just talking, me and Faisal, about your epic interview with Rishi Sunak.
Well, the question is whether you mean epic in quality or in length. It's certainly
both.
It's certainly very long, isn't it? Which is a new thing for me, and I think it's a new thing for the BBC to do what some American podcasts do routinely, which is to talk to someone for a couple of hours. And I have to say, I was a bit of a sceptic before doing it. It was the former Prime Minister was determined he'd do a conversation, not an interrogation, a podcast rather than a conventional news programme. I needed some persuading, but I have to say, I hope people find if they listen to it, there's quite a lot that comes out of it that wouldn't have done from a conventional interview.
Oh, I totally agree. And I listened to it over my breakfast this morning. And we'll come on to kind of the philosophy behind it in a second. But just that point that me and Faisal were talking about there about Rishi Sunak saying, yeah, we need to tackle the sickness-related bit of the welfare bill. He talks about actually you need to quite radically rethink what the state does, doesn't he?
Exactly that. And you can see in him the frustrated former Chancellor. This is a guy, remember, spent a fortune, and we really do mean a fortune, on tackling the COVID pandemic. 400 billion quid. Now, what does that mean? Because it's a vast sum, which, frankly, I don't really understand. But I got someone to do the numbers for me. It means the whole of the budget for the NHS, the whole of the defence budget, the whole of the education budget, the whole of the policing budget, all add together, you still haven't got as much as that. It is a vast sum of money. But his view was always that was a one-off to stop us going through a kind of 1930s style recession. In other words, mass unemployment in the face of the COVID pandemic. But it would have to be paid back. Now, in addition, he thinks that we, as many people say, we've got to increase defence spending. Where are you going to get that money from? Not only have you not got the room to borrow more and more, you can borrow some, the Germans are doing it after all, but there's a limit to that. It also costs a lot more to borrow now than it did when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor and Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. So he's saying, therefore, you have to take big choices, make big decisions. And his big criticism about politicians, but the likes of you and me, Faisal as well, the media, in other words, and people listening, is we're not willing enough to discuss trade-offs. That if you want something, you can't have something else. And he thinks if you want defence, you're going to have to lose something. And in his case, that means billions of pounds off welfare, which means people who've currently got benefits will have to lose them, in his view.
Faisal, have you started listening to this?
I have. I haven't got through the whole thing, but I'm totally fascinated by it. And I think he's quite a fascinating character. And I always detected, and some of it came out in the bit that I heard, a bit of reluctance to assume the position that he did. I wondered if he would have preferred staying Chancellor for a bit longer, rather than take on being Prime Minister in the circumstances that he had to. But I also recall while he was Chancellor in the middle of this COVID epidemic, he was, and he reflects on this, that his approval rating went through the roof. He was hugely popular.
It was Dishy Rishi, remember?
I wondered whether as perhaps Boris Johnson, and he talked about falling out with Boris Johnson earlier than we imagined in Nick's podcast. I do wonder whether he may have noticed that the British public had changed a little bit as a result of some of those interventions.
Yeah.
Faisal, I'm going to let you go because I know you've got lots of news to do, and while me and Nick have a chat. So I'll see you later on.
Yes.
Thanks for coming in.
No worries.
Nick, just that point that Faisal was making about would Rishi Sunak have liked to stay Chancellor for longer? You actually addressed that with him, and he's quite candid about the level of disagreement between him and Boris Johnson and how long they were disagreeing on economic policy for.
That's right. They used to have regular dinners on a Sunday night in Downing Street because one living above number 11, one living above number 10. And of course, in COVID, you were limited to your ability to get out and about and see anybody else. And it became clear in our conversation that they had steadily started to fall out about economics because Sunak, having, on the one hand, given all this money, then, as I was saying a moment ago, thought, well, we've got to start paying it back. Whereas Boris Johnson was saying, let's find some new things to spend on. So an example of that is social care. Now, lots of people think the system of social care in this country is extremely unfair, that you can lose the price of your house if you're unlucky enough to have dementia yourself or your loved one has dementia, and that there should be a system of, limiting the risk, of losing your house. Sunak's view was very clear to Johnson, and it's very clear now. We can't afford it. We cannot have another scheme for the state subsidising people. Forget it. We're not going to do it because if we did, we'd have to put your taxes up. He's very clear about net zero. They fell out again and again. Remember, Boris Johnson, like Theresa May before him, was rather passionate about the idea of tackling climate change and that target of reaching net zero by 2050. Rishi Sunak stayed as Prime Minister, signed up to the idea, but briefly said, or towards the end of his premiership, said, let's do it a bit slower, let's loosen some of these targets. Now he says he'd get rid of the legal targets altogether. He's not a climate change sceptic, but he is, in the words of Kemi Badenoch, the new Tory leader, he's a net zero sceptic. He's doubtful that the price that people have to pay is wise. And these arguments are one of the reasons he quit Boris Johnson's cabinet. Partygate was another. And of course, his critics would say ambition was a third, that he wanted to get rid of Johnson.
And just in terms of other bits of news that emerged from the interview, as opposed to kind of insight, which is slightly different, he's very down on his own slogan of "Stop the Boats."
He certainly is. It's extraordinary to think, isn't it? Because if you and I had sat here and said, what's one phrase? What's the slogan? What's a promise you associate with Rishi Sunak? I think we'd instantly both have said, "Stop the boats." You know, not only did he say it again and again, he was always in front of that lectern, wasn't he? With it in front of him, "Stop the boats." And I remember the day I saw it, thinking, that's a mad promise, because you won't do it. I mean, I don't mean you shouldn't want to do it. That's, a matter of political debate, whether it's a good or a bad idea. Many people would want to stop the boats if they... But to say that you will stop the boats, and compare it with Donald Trump, for example, who, whether you love or loathe him, is a great political communicator. In his first term in office, he didn't say stop illegal migration over the border from Mexico. He said build the wall. In other words, in his 3-word slogan, he said something he'd do in order to deal with the problem. And I think Sunak clearly realises that being tested against a slogan you could never, ever, ever possibly deliver, no border in the world is completely sealed, was a daft piece of political communication, and he regrets it.
Although he did that classic politician thing, which is to say, it was a problem of communication and it was the slogan was the problem, as opposed to his competency at handling the issue itself. He sort of didn't go the whole way. No,
and that means that some people on the Tory right have said the problem wasn't communication, it was that you didn't deliver, and you didn't deliver because you weren't tough enough, would say some critics on the right. They, even members of his own cabinet, even allies like a guy who was Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, now the Shadow Justice Secretary, old mate, and I do mean old, he's no longer, I think, a mate of Rishi Sunak's, fell out with him because he said, look, we've tried everything. You've got to get out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which stops us doing the sorts of tough things, intervening with the boats at sea, packing people off to Rwanda the second they land. We've got to do those things, and we can only do it by getting out of that European court. Sunak now says, in my interview with him, that he would be prepared to do that if the court doesn't change. But his critics on the right are frustrated he didn't come up with that when he was Prime Minister.
And what are we learning about what he wants to do with the rest of his life? Because, I mean, you talk about this with him quite a few times, that for an ex-Prime Minister, he's very young, still in his early 40s.
I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? 44. I mean, he was in the cabinet.
It's a great age, Nick. It's a great age.
Yes, and you've got so much ahead of you, both of you. Well, we can do something together. But no, it's an amazing thing, isn't it, to be an ex-Prime Minister? And he joked in the House of Commons the other day in a speech, was 44 too young to be an elder statesman? I get the sense he hasn't yet fully worked that out. Stage one was to stay an MP. Now, he was surrounded by social media posts. You can't be surrounded by a post. You know what I mean? There were a lot of them claiming that the reason he called an early election was they had a secret plan to head off to California, where he still had a house. He used to live there when he was a city trader, or for a period at least, and as a student. And he didn't. And he stayed in Richmond. He stayed the MP for Richmond. That is where his home is. That's where his family are, as well as living obviously some time in London because he's a member of Parliament. And I think he wants to say to people, look, I'm committed to this, which is one reason the charitable foundation he set up is called the Richmond Project, the one that deals with his particular passion, which is education, and his particular passion within that, which is trying to get the spread of numeracy. In other words, making sure that everybody has the basics of adding up, because he and his wife Akshata, who runs this project with, believe that inability to do the very basic sums that you need to do everyday tasks in life, whether it's shopping or checking your bills add up, making sure you're not ripped off by people you deal with, that if you haven't got those skills, it really holds you back. So at the moment, I think we're at that level of using that charitable foundation to take some initiatives. He did something on cancer the other day, prostate cancer. He became a spokesman for that charity as well. I can't help thinking, though, that as the next election approaches, he'll have to think, do I want to do another 5 years? Shall I pack it in? And then what would that job be?
I'm just wondering how different he seemed now from the last time you had a big high-profile conversation with him, which was during the general election when you were doing all the interviews with the individual leaders. Does he seem different?
Massively more relaxed. I mean, the curious thing, and it was just by chance, is we used the same little studio in Broadcasting House to do the interview, the Panorama election interview, as we did for this podcast. We did the same, what we call the green room. In other words, the place you have a cup of tea and a biscuit beforehand and afterwards. So I really did think, as I was chatting to him in the green room and as I was talking to him in the studio, I did keep remembering back and the tension there was. At the beginning of that election campaign, he'd had that dreadful start with announcing it in the pouring rain, then with the row about leaving the D-Day commemorations early. I remember him saying something to me about the difficulty of getting a hearing, and I came up with the not entirely original parallel, but I said, look, the electorate are a bit like an angry teenager who've stormed upstairs, slammed the bedroom door and put the music on full volume. They're not hearing anything you're saying. And one of the main reasons he had an early election was to try and kind of force people. So you've got to listen because you've got a big choice. Now, in reality, either they didn't listen or they did and they didn't like what they heard. This time round, relaxed, comfortable with himself, ready to be pretty open, I think, for a guy who's not naturally someone who talks about themselves, and a bit wistful, Adam. I thought the most striking thing was him talking about it being a lonely job. Lots of people have said that about being Prime Minister. I asked him whether he'd enjoyed it, and he really struggled to think of a moment he'd enjoyed. He thought it was important and worthwhile. And he kept coming back to this Hindu concept, and faith is clearly important to him as Britain's first Asian Prime Minister. Hindu concept of dharma, which doesn't, I'm told, strictly translate as duty. The other way of putting it is not duty so much as public service. But the concept, crucially, is this, that you do what you have to do and should do, but without an eye on getting a reward from it, without believing, because I've done this, I get something back in riches or reputation. And there's similar concepts in all big major religions, aren't there? But clearly the way he got through being Prime Minister was that sense he'd had since he was a little boy of, this is my duty. Get up, do it. Don't worry about what the consequence of doing it is. And that gave him, his word, detachment. Now, I think that detachment's a problem as well as a strength.
I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned the concept of dharma, because I think that's such a key thing to understand how he approaches the world. And you can, and it recalls that criticism that people had of him, that just getting up very early and working very hard and be able to make your own spreadsheets about the public finances rather than relying on the public servants isn't the same as either delivering in politics or winning in politics.
Yeah, or leading.
Yeah,
really,
there's no prize for turning up.
Yes, yeah. But and everyone who says there's a new diary out from the former chief whip, the guy who was in charge of discipline for the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which was quite a lively job to have at that time, it has to be said. He says that he'd never seen anybody more dedicated, that he would see Rishi Sunak hour after hour, day after day, night after night, toiling on his own in an office, through papers, through decisions. But as you say, that isn't the same as trying to lead or inspire a party, which I think people who run businesses often forget is basically a group of volunteers. Nobody has to do what a leader tells them, let alone leading a country where people have to cut some slack to a leader and say, well, times are a bit tough, but you know what? At least this guy's telling us where we're going. And I think he suffered terribly from that sense that while he was trying to crunch through problems, get inflation down, that's the thing he's proudest of, reverse long NHS waiting lists, well, he didn't manage to do it. Stopping the boats, well, clearly, as we've just discussed, he didn't manage to do that. that in a sense he wanted credit for trying and the progress he'd made. What he didn't do until the very end, when he started throwing out much bigger ideas, banning smoking and scrapping HS2 and reversing some of the net zero targets, he didn't really set up any sort of picture of where he was going.
And the picture he presented kind of changed on a sort of quarterly basis.
Yeah.
I just thought also there was two bits where he just clearly doesn't necessarily want to do the things that people want him to do. Exhibit A, when you ask him about the election defeat, and his instinct is to talk about phoning his colleagues who lost their jobs rather than sort of addressing the Conservatives' records for the 14 years that they were in office and maybe acknowledging why people might be angry with them and wanted them out of government. And secondly, when you talk about that meeting he had with Boris Johnson in Boris Johnson's office just at the start or the end of the second Tory leadership contest, when Boris Johnson was thinking about joining the fray again, and you put to him, it's like, didn't you think you should say to Boris Johnson, hang on, what makes you think you've even got the right to think about becoming Prime Minister again when your record is so kind of checkered? And he just says, oh, that wasn't, no, of course I didn't have to say that in the conversation to him. Nope.
Yeah. He's not someone who I sense relishes personal confrontation at all. So his whole instinct on coming to power was not to say, well, thank God they've gone. Liz Truss has just crashed the economy and Boris Johnson just tore up the idea of standards in public office by breaking rules that he himself had set. Now, when I put to him that he could have done those things, that he could have behaved a bit like Donald Trump had done and said, right, now I'm in, here I am with my Sharpie pen, I've got a whole series of things I want to do straight away, I'm going to get my Elon Musk figure in to cut public spending. He said, again, slightly wistfully, I thought, he said, look, I thought stability was what mattered. That meant bringing people together. And then he pauses and says, well, I could have done that. I suppose some people would think I should have done that, but it would have been very high risk, which of course it would have been. It could have been that the whole thing imploded given the state of the Tory party. But it really did mean that he had to spend most of his premiership looking over his shoulder and wondering what this or that faction, or indeed cabinet minister, for goodness sake, people like Suella Braverman, who he brought into the cabinet against everybody's advice, well, not everybody, but a lot of people's advice, meant that again struggled to give a clear sense of direction.
I also wonder, like, talking about what his role is going to be in our national life for the next few decades, if maybe he will get drawn into something that he's not keen to do, which is identity politics. Because actually, the bit that comes kind of closest to being emotional in the interview is when you say about those podcasters that questioned whether he was really English or not.
Yeah.
And there's a big pause as he sort of grapples with it because, well, obviously it's a big subject, but also it's something he doesn't really want to get involved in. That's not his area.
I mean, of course I'm English. Born here, brought up here. Of course I'm English. Actually, funnily enough, I think when we were doing that first one of these some time back, you asked about the Tebbit test, and I think you did.
I did.
It struck me actually, funnily enough, that this debate it moves well beyond that, because it's not enough just to support England, at cricket. It turns out it may not be enough to even play for England in cricket or football. You still can't be English. You look at the composition of our England cricket team, England football team on this definition. You can't be English even playing for England, let alone supporting them. So I think I found the whole thing slightly ridiculous.
Yeah, he said that the most remarkable thing about being the first British Asian Prime Minister was how unremarkable it had been. And he clearly loved that. He was simultaneously the proud grandson of a poor Indian immigrants who'd made it, but at the same time thought it was brilliant that he was not endlessly referred to by his race, ethnic background, religion. He just is the Prime Minister. He gets on with his job. That's what he thought Britishness is really about. You don't have to make a big fuss about it, but he could light Diwali candles in the windows of Downing Street with his daughters without anybody making a big fuss, but it being a very important moment for British Hindus, seeing that happened at the very highest level in British public life. But he can't avoid it now. I have to say, when I first heard that there was a podcaster who'd said, and it was pretty stark what he said, can you be brown and Hindu and English? And he suggested you couldn't. I thought, you know what? I don't think I want to even have that conversation. Thank you very much. We decided on the Today podcast that we would eventually. It means quite a lot to my fellow podcaster Amal Rajan for other obvious reasons. But we did as well because other people started to pick it up, including Suella Braverman, who then wrote a piece in The Telegraph saying that she, as a second-generation immigrant born in Britain, did not think she could be English. Could be British, but not English, because she suggested it was an ethnicity, it was a cultural issue. Sunak just wanted to knock that on the head. I mean, he wasn't rude about her, but he was pretty dismissive of the idea. He said, look, born here, bred here, schooled here, spent my life here and serving. And he said, this is a concept that would mean large parts of the English cricket and English football teams, English teams, could not refer to themselves as English. How daft, my word, not his, how daft is that, was clearly what he thinks.
Yeah, I just wonder if he'll be drawn into that conversation more and more than he might like in the next few years. Don't suppose you're watching Prime Minister's Questions today, were you?
I heard clips, I didn't watch it live.
Well, so I just wanted, there was a fascinating bit at the very start where Keir Starmer did a thing that basically David Cameron and Gordon Brown used to do a lot, which was to pay tribute to soldiers who'd lost their lives in Afghanistan. Right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was absolutely fascinating because that is the diplomatic but also deniable smackdown to JD Vance and his comments yesterday about European countries that hadn't fought wars for 30 years.
How very interesting, yes. And it's evidence, isn't it, of the care Starmer is taking walking this tightrope. Do not directly confront JD Vance or Donald Trump, but do send signals to people who loathe what they're saying, whether about that sneering comment from JD Vance about, you know, kind of some countries who've never fought a war for 30, 40 years, offering up 20,000 troops, or Trump's behaviour towards Zelensky, sending signals. You don't have to say Donald Trump behaved appallingly. You just hug Vladimir Zelensky outside the black door of number 10. That does all you need to do. Don't need to do more than that. Nobody can quote it and shove it in front of the president and say, have you seen what he said? You know, and I have to say, I think so far it's a pretty impressive walking of the tightrope. There's a much bigger question, which is, will it lead to anything? Will it actually change anything, or is it just maintaining a kind of civility in the relationship across the Atlantic?
Nick, thank you very much. Do you want to do the plug for Political Thinking?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. If you want to listen to Rishi Sunak, not in 1 hour, but in 2, it is on Political Thinking on BBC Sounds. And if you want to watch it with magic moving pictures, you can do it on BBC 2 at 7 o'clock. And indeed, if you don't catch any of that, there's a 1 hour special on Radio 4 tomorrow night at 8 o'clock.
Multimedia. Nick, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And you can go and listen to Nick's podcast now because it's the end of this episode of this podcast, but we'll be back with another newscast very soon. Bye-bye.